Okay, Stuart is here.
The guest of honor is here, so we are ready to go.
Stuart is our guest of honor.
Well, it's about his work.
Okay.
But having said that, I don't mind. As an outsider, I'm seeing certain things, and so I'm actually noticing the difference between all of you. So I don't mind doing this again about someone else's work, because I just think this could be very productive.
Let's see.
Just one thing, Bernard, do you want to turn on your video?
And the same for Hornung.
Oh, that's Bernd.
Bernd. All right.
There he is.
Hello, Bernd.
Hello, Horo.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with sharing my screen. Give me a minute. Yeah. Does everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So I thought of this as kind of a cybernetic event that we're all giving feedback to each other, and we start doing it through the work of Stuart, because Stuart was the one who introduced me to you all. It just kind of happened, self-organizing, I guess. But we discovered something in common, and so it's very natural that I'm actually starting with Stuart. And we have been emailing back and forth for the last 2-3 weeks. So I copied some of his email answers in the text, and that's in purple. And when I deliberately added something, because I put that in the color ochre, and then black is just regular descriptive stuff. And what I've also done, I've cut and pasted some stuff from Stuart's papers, because he said things that caught my attention. And then as a last note, I should say, because I read the 2014 paper in Constructivist Foundations and the answers to that. And then I started reading forward to the present. So I didn't really go in any detail in anything that was published before 2014. So I wanted to do much more, but I basically realized as I started thinking about it, is that if we just look at how shall we articulate the problem, that there is already a lot of stuff that we can talk about and use to stimulate our thinking about cybernetics. And so this the thing that caught my attention was this the closing sentence, or in the closing paragraph of the 2014 paper, is that we need to transition from a descriptive conception of science to a participatory conception of science. And as I may have revealed more or less clearly, there is a reason this caught my attention, because this is exactly what I'm doing for the last 25 years. So it's so it was kind of obvious. I said, wow, this is cool. There is something to be said about it, and this is like really fundamentally important. And so I didn't need to be convinced anymore. However, when I started to formulate it in terms of questions, and so I started by the questions that I sent you. So what is involved in this transition? And once we look at second order cybernetics and second order science, and we look at the writings, we see there are some differences. So how shall we deal with these differences? And then how shall we develop a strategy? So once I started asking these questions, I realized there were actually possibly many more problems that Stuart might have been working on that had nothing to do with my my first impression that that it was like mostly focusing on how to transition from a descriptive to a participatory science and philosophy. And so what I will do now is I will walk through those, dus these 7 possible problems that I discovered, and I will give some evidence that I think those problems exist. But what I was also hoping is I want to encourage you to interrupt me while I'm doing this, because there might be things that you see that I don't see. And so I'm going to start just with this first problem. And so the reason if there's something you really want to tell me, just please do. And as
Can
a
I?
footnote,
Can I?
yeah.
Shall I? Because if you ask the question, what can make, how can we move the field forward?
Yeah.
Yeah. Then this is not an, in itself, an idea of that there is a handle on the system. Well, Maturana's point is that a self-organizing system cannot be instructed.
Cannot be instructed.
It cannot
And
be instructed.
Instructed, yes.
So there can be no linear model here. There can be no cause effect.
Yeah, and that is very interesting that you mentioned that, because that's precisely one of those subtle contradictions that I kind of will point out, and what that actually means, and whether there's a way to
And also
actually...
the idea that we can participate, it is the system which decides whether we participate.
Yeah, and again, that gets back to actually what I maybe would say, there's something in philosophy of science that's called the God's eye view of the world. Just that when people say the system decides, what they're actually thinking is I decide, and what I'm telling is the truth. So it's not really the system, it's really a negotiation process. And what I'm just doing here is I'm trying to give different views on that. That one person say no, it's the system, and another says no, we're negotiating, and the best negotiator will win at the end of the day. And that actually, Lud, brings up the field of communication, and
Precisely.
and I will actually talk about that specifically. So when I say this, the first thing is this the problem. If we want to transition, we need to explain. Okay, this first we can say there's nothing we do. We're just vessels, and there is a spirit acting through us, and poof, we have a system. But if we make this argument, that's actually Hegel who presented the evolution of philosophy. So we're actually walking the talk of Hegel. So here it could be helpful that we explain to people. So you have a choice to talk like Hegel, or you have a choice to talk like someone else. And then let's see, yes.
Yeah, Bernard here, might I say something about this descriptive versus participatory distinction as I see it applying to cybernetics in particular. May I?
Go ahead.
Yes,
Thank you.
please.
Yeah. In 1956, at one of the cybernetics conferences in Namur in Belgium, a chap called Louis Coufinal defined cybernetics as l'art d'assurer l'efficacité de l'action, the art of assuring the efficacy of action.
Yes.
Right from the beginning, there was a sense that cybernetics is applied, and Stafford Beer used to say that operational, what do we call it, operations research is cybernetics applied, and so on. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that once you get second order cybernetics via von Furser, and his idea that the observer should take responsibility, then it puts the observer in the world. He's no longer an external observer standing outside, the physical world to observe. He's someone who is immediately he cannot not participate in the world in which he finds himself or herself.
If I could also talk about the descriptive and participatory science and philosophy. The descriptive, what Bernard just said, was you're outside the system. In some way, we need to make sure that that's the definition for descriptive. Because in the 1887 article by Franz Boas, the German who came to America and created American anthropology, basically, his article on the study of geography said that is a descriptive science that describes the ground, the environment, the person, the anthropographic, and the cosmographic of the images that they create. So he was talking about a descriptive science versus an analytic, logical, positivist science that we have today. So we may want to define our terms. The participatory and the comments by Bernard about the gentleman from Belgium is right on target. But the descriptive is not as clear.
Yeah, and I didn't put it in the slide because I wanted this to be about Stuart's work. But this paper, this 99 paper that I shared with you of mine, I set up there explicitly the distinction between a descriptive and a participatory science as something that starts with the mindset, and then next the metaphors that guide our communication, and then also how we think about communication. And so you, I mean, I can't pull that up, but I just want here to set it up as, hey, we need to agree if this is what we're doing, and then which, what definitions or this or explanations or whatever shall we start with, and they don't have to be perfect and everything, but they're like offered as an opening move, and then people can add to it. And then make also clear how are we going about it. Is it like a mindset? Is it a model that we're going to develop? I should have added that. Just a model that we put on paper to say, look, this is the mind. This is possibly the mindset you may have when you're descriptive, and this is the model, a mindset you may have when you're more participatory, and that we go through the trying to pin down what it means so that we kind of have a common ground. So, but this, I thought that was a good starting point. Now, if we go...
If I could just go back to that about the verbs and nouns.
Yes.
Verbs, of course, action-oriented, but they're really predicates that describe characteristics that imbue the environment, the action field, the domain of interactions. So understanding predicates and verbs is very important. It's not just action, it's defining the characteristics, and that's what a predicate does.
Yeah. So I should add thing that is missing a little bit is sensitivity to the context, because the verbs we may use, they're being heard by or read by an interlocutor, and we may think that we have the correct I mean that we're doing it all perfect, but if we don't pay attention to the context of the interlocutor, he may get something completely different from our verbs. And so that we are, so that's what I think ought to be included based on what we just talked about. So then, so we can explain
yes.
it. Go ahead.
Can I make a remark to your previous slide?
Yes.
Go up one. Because I think all those things are part of any paradigm, of any theory, and not specific to second order, cybernetic second order science. Because in the end, every theory is linked to a mindset, every theory results in a certain scientific or non-scientific terminology and so on. So there is also a specific language connected to cybernetics, a little bit different to systems, and sometimes quite different to ordinary science, non-cybernetic and non-systemic. So I think this is not something specific to a second order science.
And that is correct, but that can also then be used as an opportunity to develop connections to the other fields, at least as I see it. If they're already doing it, then you can say, and this is how cybernetic, second order cybernetics would further inform that activity to make you more sensitive. How, for instance, the metaphors that you use may close your mind and thinking to cybernetics and second order cybernetics, or them actually make you more open and interested in it.
If I could add a G to that.
Yes.
Sensitivity to the context is very important, but what is unique is the design of the environment.
Yeah.
And when you're moving from things to relationships and communication and interaction, it's not just about the things, me, you, etc. It's about the design of our environment that we bounce off of.
Yeah.
And the rules from which you as a female, I as a male interact within our larger super framework of culture.
And so would you include also the built environments?
Oh, absolutely. I'd call it the institutional, built architectural, but it's the institutions and laws as seen in the American experiment that was the radical switch of thinking from Western tradition of going of, we're not about things and parts, because all politics is about how do you define parts to wholes or wholes to parts. And they said, no, you don't have a God, king, and the peons. You develop it, out of the many one. So that you have to design the environment, the interactive environment of checks and balances, feedback loops, etc., in order to make it work. It's a design problem.
Maybe I'm taking it too far now, but as soon as you say there's a relationship, there's an architecture being a set of relationships, building up an architecture, I think that's variation. And from the perspective of second order cybernetics, I would say it's more important where the zeros are, the non-relations, because that's the selection structure being reflected in the present, which remains latent.
I think that's brilliant, because if you look at like Ikebana in flower arranging in Japan, it's the negative space that's the most important space, because it's latent and provides the participatory environment for you to put yourself into that creation.
Yes, fully agree.
So Lou and Lowell, I will take that up when I start, I mean, at least in the slides, when I start talking about actual feedback loops. Maybe also here.
Yes.
Maybe I should say sensitivity to feedback loops. And then I will talk much more about the sensitivity. So,
you're doing a fine job.
Stuart, I haven't heard from you yet, but it's really about what will you, I mean, in whatever next paper that is specifically dedicated to the topic, what is the thing that most excites you or is passionate or whatever? But also in the back of my mind was that issue of the National Science Foundation grant. And I'm actually thinking I may be giving you a blueprint here for that grant if you want to ever further pursue that particular angle. So I really, it's like food for thought, and then the answers, that's during the actual writing, I guess. So I started with saying, just explaining the difference so that everyone kind of has an opportunity to start thinking about the difference. But it's not just about, my analytical brain now understands the difference. It's also how to do participatory science. So that's not anymore about analytic brain or ability to talk about it among whoever is interested. It's actually about walking the talk. And so what is involved in walking the talk of doing the second order cybernetics? And now I'm coming in as someone who wasn't really familiar with it. So what I think the walking the talk is that we actually really talk about feedback loops in in all the possible way that these feedback loops takes place. Like for instance, talk about non-relations. Lou, how did you express that?
Yeah, maybe that's taking us too far away, but I would call that redundancy. The zeros.
Redundancy. Dus
So
other.
it
I'll
is.
just call it other.
It is 0
Every
times log 0 in Shannon's talk. Yeah, so you get a 0 there.
feedback loops. Redundancies.
What redundancy is the repetition of a pattern.
Yeah, but
And
it is
that
also in
pattern
the,
is the closure upon which you have the living organism or an idea set.
it's also the complement of the information to the maximum entropy.
The subtext is, would that be, or is, if I use the word subtext, does that ring a bell? The thing that is not being said.
Okay.
Is that?
Okay, I want you to go on also.
Okay.
Okay.
But I would like to come back for a moment to the feedback loops and also the redundancies, because I don't see that as specific to second order science. Feedback loops are everywhere in system science, everywhere in cybernetics. And I think we have to specify feedback loops between the researcher and what he researches or she researches.
Yes, okay.
That specific kind of feedback loops, which I think does not exist in ordinary analytical science. It does exist since a long time in some research and practice about development studies, participative development, participative research in that area has been common since, well, not common, but well known since decades, but not in the wide field of normal science of nowadays.
That is very correct, and I should have put that there first because that's what it is really about, and include a discussion of negative space.
One of the unique things that has only come to me recently in trying to think through what Heinz von Forster was saying in 1971, when I was with him with Mexico, was the importance of meaning. If you're using with the world of subjects, what is the production of meaning? And as I've been working with the American Revolution and how they thought, it really was about the ownership of the means of production of meaning, of personhood, of identity. And what we're seeing and suffering from now is the breakdown of that means of production of meaning now in our, because we have no union anymore.
Yeah.
At least something has changed. But there is, of course, a symbolic layer also in modern society.
All right. So I going to the yeah. So now here I got to things that I picked up from what Stuart was saying, that I thought kind of that brought out Bernd what you just said. Those are the quotes that I took directly from the text of Stuart that I noticed that he's talking about. That is the thinking participants who are kind of just become sensitive that they're part of a social system, and that the system, how they talk about the system, makes them change their behavior, and whether that is being acknowledged in traditional science. And especially the second quote, we are learning to think about ourselves as participants in the system we study. So there is, that brings us, is going to bring us to the next topic. And then also in the problem statement is, yeah, so that is a more general description. Actually, and here we really are going to the next problem. And so the next problem is, what about this word science? Maybe the word science needs to be redefined, because we just use that word and maybe it's not doing a job anymore. And what I'm trying to say is, if we say second order science, is that still people might not get what the second order is. So, and that gets back to some of the earlier slides and what Bernd said, that there always needs to be, that it needs to be ultra clear what is meant by science in the traditional descriptive first order versus the second order. And what I got from Stuart's writings is that right now it's like the physical sciences and then the social sciences are kind of a special case of the physical sciences. But I think in cybernetics is people are trying to turn it around and say, no, the physical sciences are actually a special case of the social sciences. And the social sciences are like the prototype to see really clearly how the observer is interacting with his studies, the object or subject that he's studying, and is changing the system while he's observing it. And that is, okay, I'm going to go back to. And then I think, now here I'm actually having quotes directly from Stuart's work, just treating physics, dus treating physics not as an example for all sciences, but rather as a special case of a larger conception of science that helps the unification of the sciences. So the larger conception of science, Stuart, I think you would, I mean, probably you have a paper somewhere where you do that already in great detail, but anyway, that really caught my attention. That is really important. Now, what I did notice in your 2014 paper is you kind of made a reference to Bohr and then to climate change, but I think it might have been useful to kind of highlight how quantum mechanics was the science or something that really made people think about the question. And then I use some dramatical examples of like scientists who not realize that they're working in a living system and changing the system while they're doing their research. And so that this is, Stuart, I think the paradigm shift you're talking about. And this in quantum mechanics, nuclear energy, I think, is the best example of we're just doing science, but in reality, we're exposing our body to the radiation that we're creating and concentrating. And so we're really changing the built environment while doing science. So that is just the question of how shall we just think about how science is different in a cybernetics approach. And I think that maybe the problem while people are not really listening is because they don't get it. That there is this real practical difference, and that needs to really be explained over again in examples, starting with the textbooks in whatever in high school where science is being explained. And here we also see the difference maybe between the United States and Europe, that Europe has made much more progress, and perhaps also Australia compared with the United States. Now here, what is the big problem that Stuart is working on? So this comes directly from an email. And I picked up in that email this really the talk about the feedback loops between the observer, I should add, and the object of study, and the research. Okay, the research problem. Okay, I'm not going to repeat the email because I think everyone, the text, because everyone can read it, but I'm just going to add.
I want to
Yes.
come in.
Yeah.
I think if you talk about what normal science is, you are giving a positivistic picture of science. Science as it is not what the positivists tell us that it is objective, distanced, knowledge-based, and only cognitive. So perhaps it is more second-order cybernetics itself than it is. It certainly is more second-order cybernetic than what is depicted by the positivist.
If I could just comment upon when you can, your mid part of that purple, consider feedback, reflection, communication, control, self-organization, regulation. On your previous slide, you had a quote from Stuart talking about Robert Boyle and the Invisible College. And that was a different form of science. It was natural philosophy and natural science together. Boyle, in his experiments in chemistry, would take a glass vacuum, in a sense, put in a mouse, and after a while, it would die. He would then say, gee, this is something like an algebraic formula. I know this and I know this, but there must be something I don't know. And then he put a plant in that little area, and there was a really interesting interaction that he couldn't see, but he understood existed between carbon dioxide and oxygen, ultimately, which was discovered. But they were able to do experiments about holes of interaction. And that republic of letters, or the Invisible College, is what really founded the American experiment. I mean, the carrier pigeons going across the Atlantic and up and down the East Coast between all the founders. When you read that thing, Jefferson, they think, had 75,000 letters at least. They have 45,000. This was a prolific interaction that had time, space between because of time, delivery, etc. But it created an invisible college of reflection, of feedback, communication, self-organization, all those things you're talking about. So it's how we...
Invisible.
Invisible. Yeah, it's invisible.
Yes.
A republic of letters.
We only have the letters, we don't have the college.
Right.
Well, Loot, I think this word invisible is very important, but I'll just defer for later, because everyone is talking here about observable and observation, this and that, but it's actually all, I personally think, in the unobservable. And Lowell's example is beautiful. I mean, this is the plant, the mouse, and the thing that was invisible, and that eventually, is it still invisible? Is it visible? I think these are very important questions, since we are interacting with the things we're studying. So can we call it visible when we're actually interacting with it? Or is that an artificial distinction for the purpose of talking with each other? But so let's move on to some more quotes. So here it's about the fact that just that Stuart makes very clear that it is about some sort of a problem and a purpose. And so so now the question is like, is the problem really driving the purpose, or is the purpose kind of driving the problem? But what is important is that I think that the language of the participation becomes more clear, and okay, there is an acknowledgement that we need to have some observations at some point and some descriptions, but we really need to talk about the purpose just in the mind of the observer, and then also this question or problem, and then there can be a dynamic between the two as the research project proceeds. And so then we get this further, that is another blurb that Stuart sent me, and he used the word cybernetics. I think you meant second order cybernetics, so I added second order. And here again, it's this new conception of science that is founded in second order cybernetics. And dus the example at the bottom, how far to go, is to even think of Darwin's theory as an expression of second order cybernetics. And I'll give you now maybe an opportunity to read in case you wanted to add something. So it's the scientists are thinking of themselves in a slightly different way when they think as second order cyberneticians, as opposed to the linear positivistic scientists. And commenting on something that Lou said earlier, I think it is really a great challenge of the young scientists that they come in the university and they're bombarded by all these messages that reinforce the linear thinking, and that they really need tools they need to disinfect themselves. I mean, they need to kind of cleanse themselves of all those messages that they recognize that they're being bombarded. It's like viral particles, and that may stick on them and contaminate their thinking, and that is where the communication field can be really of help, I guess. So,
Bernadette, may I comment?
yes.
Well, it's this issue of where cybernetics fits into the world. Just recently, I noticed that Greta Thunberg, who you've probably all heard of,
Yeah.
at the age of 16, if you read any of her speeches or listen to them, she uses the terms positive feedbacks and tipping points with confidence and accuracy. And that's from a 16-year-old. I mean, the whole world is becoming more aware of, you know, the non-linear, put it that way around. So
Yeah.
there's opportunity for cybernetics to make itself better known in the world. With respect to the topic of cybernetics as a foundation for the social sciences, I remember when I signed up for a PhD as a postgraduate in the 60s, I think, early 70s. And the argument then was that people needed to be secure in a first discipline, i.e. they need to be reasonably sophisticated scientifically before they took on cybernetics. My personal experience was quite the opposite of that. I found my first discipline, psychology, to be a complete mess of competing paradigms and faculty who didn't speak to each other. I just thought it was nonsense until, thankfully, I was introduced to cybernetics. By that time, I was in my third year as an undergraduate, but it completely transformed my understanding of science and psychology. So it provided me with foundations for psychology. So I think that we can get in there with, you know, there's no excuse for not delivering cybernetic and systems thinking into young people, and I certainly think that the social sciences could do with a good cleanup using the concepts of cybernetics to get rid of the conceptual confusion. Just another example at the moment of what's going on. I don't know if any of you pay attention to the sort of recently arisen discipline of semiotics, biosemiotics and zoosemiotics. And there is there's a huge literature now, and people are forever coming out with another book with 14 chapters, all by different authors. They're all theoretical, speculative, and there's no consistency in concepts of community or ideas between any of them. It's just it's as bad as this field of consciousness studies. It's just people, you know, philosophizing in the vague sense of thinking out loud. It's quite atrocious. So there really is a need for cybernetics to play a part in the social sciences.
Well, if I may add to this briefly, same experience in sociology. I'm a sociologist, and I had exactly the same experience in sociology, which was a mess until a smart professor introduced systems thinking.
I have other experiences. I mean, I would say the sciences themselves are developing in this direction. So, for example, I've been the coordinator for many years of the freshmanship program of the University of Amsterdam, and particularly the social science part of it, which was organized under the heading of organization and entropy. And people all agreed from all the disciplines to have that heading and to meet each other on that ground. And for example, I remember a meeting where someone from physics wrote on the blackboard the laws of nature, and then he turned himself and he put quotation marks around that. So people are aware of those things, and we don't have a specific mission to bring cybernetics to the world. The world is full of it.
So, Loet, if I may then, so I'm from Belgium originally, I'm from Antwerp. And so now I live in Ithaca, New York. And so I'm giving them American perspective. And I used to think like you, it's all just happening by itself. And I'm just one water molecule in the wave that brings us the better world. But that's the whole point.
I'm not saying that we have to be passive. I only
No, but I'm active. I'm active, but in the United States there is a positive feedback loop that's totally going the other direction, and there is a resistance, and it's coming your way, and we cannot ignore it, and it is
yeah, of course in the United States you have intelligent design and things like that.
Yeah, but it is taking over. I mean, it's happening around the Netherlands. I mean, in Poland. I mean, there are all these countries that suddenly are taking steps backward. But let me get back to what Bernard said about the mess and how it resolved itself. Lowell gave me a quote from Gordon Task that I was not aware of, and that is finding a defensible metaphor that works and run with it. And that is personally what happened with me with the work of Karl Popper. I discovered metaphors in him that worked for me. And then it took me another 4 years to actually look up the theory of metaphors and find out the importance of metaphors. So, so that is another way. Interestingly, that's something, Stuart, if I may say, that you don't really talk about, and that may be totally all right. But for me, that was very revealing to realize that there is this person. I mean, Bernard Scott. I literally learned about this last week from Lowell, so I've been thinking about this, but how he defines cybernetics as finding suitable metaphors to work with. And I was just curious whether that was the way you got introduced to it, or whether there was...
Now, the passage quote says justifiable metaphors.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, what he's doing is highlighting, he's compressing into a couple of sentences. First of all, the idea that with a metaphor, you have a model of some sort.
Yeah.
Scientists construct models. It's
Yeah.
also there's the semantic view, and then justifiable immediately implies that the scientist is a member of a community, and he has to justify what he's doing within the community.
Yeah, and I found that I didn't know that about past, and so if I said something negative, I apologize, because that's exactly, I'm just throwing that out there as a personal experience, that this interaction with metaphors is really what made a huge difference for me. So now,
May I
If I
still,
could say something
Jaimi?
about metaphors. Metaphors are very similar to paradoxes. Metaphors allow one domain of interaction or meaning to interact with another. Paradoxes are more like a Thomas Kuhn paradigm shifts, where there's anomalies within your system and you say something doesn't work, something doesn't fit. But it's kind of like a spectrum between how do you talk between different meaning sets, symbolic sets, languages, and when something within your language doesn't interact with the environment and the environment's kicking back at you.
Lowell, there's an irony here in that in order to expound our theories of metaphor, we use metaphor. And there's a strong thesis. It really comes from also, not just from Pask, who held this thesis, but also from Lakoff and Johnson, is that all our language behavior, all our languaging, as we're trying to say, is at the end of the day metaphorical, based on analogies or metaphors.
Or relations.
The classic text about that, which you may be familiar with, is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But that's a longer story. If you've never read it, read it. I recommend you read it.
May I come in?
yes.
Of course.
Jaimi, because I think it's common among cyberneticians to point to the world, and particularly to the academia as being not sufficiently open to cybernetics. And that is an important message that to be given. But there's also a weakness in that message, and I would particularly like to hear Stuart's perspective on that. Because the weakness, in my opinion, is that there is all the time a reference to Ashby, there's here, and to Pask, and to even older guys, without any progression. There's no research program. There's nobody is presenting results. There are no results. There's a repetition of statements and beliefs. So I thought that I would like to bring that up.
What was interesting, after I finished my degree at University of California, Santa Cruz in History of Consciousness, under Bateson, I said, what should I do? He says, go out and run experiments. We don't know enough. You have to get results from changing systems. How do systems change? And that's what I've been playing with for 50 years. So you have to go out and do it. It's applied epistemology, as Mary Catherine Bateson says.
So, Stuart, would you like to comment?
Yeah, okay. Well, on Lot's point, it's very similar to what Mike Jackson was saying at the ASC online meeting recently, where he says, second order cybernetics has no means of application. And I said, well,
It
I
has,
didn't
but
do
it
that.
doesn't work with them.
I said, the way I see it is think of, first off, I think you have to think at three levels. You have to think at the level of practice, of theory, and philosophy of science.
Right.
Americans don't think about the philosophy of science because they never studied it. That's a sort of extreme statement, but I think that's true for most scientists in the US. So basically, you're missing a large piece of what makes up cybernetics. Now, second order cybernetics is applied at the level of philosophy. So if you're not interested in philosophy, you're not going to see second order cybernetics. It's not going to make any sense to you. And the way I explain it is, think of two parts of social science. One part is what I call academic social science, where you work with data and statistics. You publish in peer-reviewed journals. You try to get propositions at a high level of statistical significance, et cetera. Then you have action research. And action research is when you work with people and organizations and try to help them improve their performance. Now, action research is sort of on the side of social science. It's not really a part of mainstream social science. It's just something you do after you've studied social science. And then if you want to use it in the world, then go ahead and do it and call that action research. Now, let me just say here something that I don't normally talk about, and that is Carl Mueller had a great influence on me. We used to interact quite frequently. He was the one who put together the two journal special issues on second order science and second order cybernetics. And my interactions with Heinz von Forster largely stopped when I moved from Illinois to Washington, D.C., which was about 1975. Now, we continued to work on conferences for a few years, but my close interactions with him were in the early days of second order cybernetics. Carl sort of discovered Heinz von Forster later and put me in touch, and Heinz put me in touch with Carl. So in a sense, I'm very familiar with the first part of second order cybernetics. Mueller is very familiar with the second part of second order cybernetics. And it was Carl and Albert Mueller that wrote this book, The Beginning of Heaven and Earth Has No Name, which was a dramatic reinterpretation of all of science based upon including the observer in propositions. So I highly recommend that book. It's, in a sense, a reinterpretation of science. So,
say the title once more, please.
The Beginning of Heaven and Earth Has No Name. It was 7 days of second order cybernetics. It's transcriptions of conversations between Heinz and Carl and Albert Mueller that took place on Rattlesnake Hill. That's Heinz's house in Pescadero, California. It has about half a dozen introductions trying to explain the book. I recommend not reading those and just getting into the book. You can easily get bogged down in the introductions to the book.
Stuart,
so,
I'd just like to share it. It's a wonderful book. I agree with you. I recommend it also.
Yeah.
Carl has a strong hand in how the books presented. But it's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, and Carl was very instrumental in behind the scenes of the work with Alex Riegler. In fact, Riegler was a student of me and Carl Mueller, more Mueller because they both lived in Vienna, but Alex studied with me one semester when I was teaching at the University of Vienna. So in any case, so that's a little background on how these things came about. So the basic point that I wanted to make about applications of cybernetics or second order cybernetics is that I see second order cybernetics as a philosophical argument that justifies a shift from academic social science to action research.
Yeah.
And that's in a sense a shift from descriptive science to participatory science. And as Jaimi has quite correctly pointed out, there are many, many people who have seen that, said this, that action is absolutely essential. It's not just a matter of description. So when Mike Jackson said that there are no applications of second order cybernetics, I said, no, there are. It's one big application. It's a shift of social science from description to participation. And second order cybernetics makes the case for that. So it's a reinterpretation of what social science is or should be.
With a professional, practical flavor in your presentation. I would say it's the dynamics of communication, which is a field of science.
I'm happy with that.
But then you can do experiments.
Yeah.
You can look for patterns.
But more than communication, Lute, what you said when you had the introductory course on organization and entropy, I think that's part of the key. It's not just communication, it's the organization of communication and interaction. And that comes at a higher level. And when Stuart's talking about levels, that's something that I think the social sciences are behind 100 years or more of the hard sciences, because we don't think of levels of interaction with different logics.
Yes, I agree.
Let me expand on that a little bit. I have made the case many times, and people correct me and say that I'm mistaken or misguided, but that, and I would refer to a guy we might want to include in these discussions named Dick Gregory. He was a student of Pask. Pangaro knows him. All the Pask people knew him. He went into AI and became an AI researcher. And he has done some work on the history of philosophy, in which he points out that there are these two lines of thought within philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle is more the realist. Plato is more the idealist. And to the extent that Americans know anything about philosophy, that is, I'm talking about practical scientists. Obviously, people who are philosophers know, but practical scientists aren't much exposed to philosophy in the United States. They don't know the Platonic tradition, which focuses much more on ideas and stories and metaphors and the kinds of things that Jaimi's interested in. Whereas for Americans, if it's not real, if it's not physical, if it's not measurable, if you can't weigh it, it doesn't exist or it's not worth paying attention to. And that leaves us very much at sea when we have so much activity going on now about alt science and fake news and because we're not somehow used to assessing information that we read something, we say, oh, well, that must be true because it's here in print. I've had students tell me in the past that I would give them a copy of a paper that was printed out or duplicated on a typewriter, and they read it, oh, that's interesting. And then they'd see the printed version from a journal article and say, oh, now I understand what you're talking about. It was much more persuasive when it was typeset than when it was just typed. I thought something weird is going on here. So Americans are just not that familiar with philosophical arguments and philosophical reasoning.
You were anti-American?
Stuart, I would like to add a qualification that perhaps Americans are actually very familiar with Plato, but it's a Christianized Plato. And they're totally, I've seen it, they're totally able to get what you say, but you have to say the heaven or the Platonic heaven is the Christian heaven.
So that's why the Muellers started off with the beginning of heaven and earth. Huh?
Yeah, so that's maybe
There's
a
more
point
to the
where they
title
can,
than I thought.
yeah.
Just an interjection, as this American, I have to set up a Zoom meeting for another group. So I apologize, I have to step out, but I will put together a Zoom meeting for next week and invite some people for that. So,
Yeah.
Okay,
Looking forward.
sorry, I
Yeah.
have to leave.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I want to maybe add two more comments. Loot, what you said about the negative. I think there's actually something very important to. There is something, a negative argument like, oh, they don't appreciate us, but there is a danger of putting that too often in print, I guess, because then that invokes a binary metaphor that is like the us versus them, and then people immediately say, well, we don't need you, if they feel they're being accused of being ignorant. So I think that this kind of I've experienced that in my own research, to kind of point out the problem and say like half of you are totally not thinking. That means that just half of the Academy of Management, in my case, they just don't read what I'm saying because they've already decided that I'm wrong before I said anything. So just to just tell it all in the positive without too much emphasis on the negative is somehow important. And then I wanted to add to what Bernard Scott said about Lakoff and Johnson, and then about the art of motorcycle maintenance. There is also a book by Stephen Pepper, World Hypothesis, and Michael Jackson made a reference to it. It's from 1942. And I think that book does the best job of telling how we work with metaphors. I haven't found any book that has said it better.
Margaro Maruyama had a series of papers on paradigmatics that was very much in the Stephen Pepper spirit, and it organizes paradigms of thinking on a very high level.
Yeah, and the reason I mentioned the book is because it's already written, so it can just be republished, and as a way of starting, because Lakoff and Johnson, they did an excellent job explaining that we live by metaphors. However, there is something very poisonous in their writing, and that is that they totally privilege the machine metaphor, and they're very explicit about it occasionally. And the whole point, and the problem of the machine metaphor is that it actually somehow trivializes metaphors, because it says machine language, like the literal language of the machine, is the language that matters and the language of science. And metaphors, that is just for young children and people who do not know science. But the hardcore language is mathematics. Well, mathematics is full of metaphors itself. And Lakoff and Johnson kind of blocked that discussion of the metaphors inside mathematics. And the best example is their own writing about mathematics. the way they don't acknowledge, I mean, they just say no, our brain is, I mean, they just don't address the question, is there any specific metaphor that played an important role in the emergence of the history of mathematics and logic? I'm just throwing that out there as a possible issue to explore. So, okay, so now I get to the next slide. I know, so this is still more about the Swadis dus cybernetics leads to a new type of science. Sorry.
Too many slides. Too many
Yeah,
sheets.
I apologize. The order of the slides was a little bit wrong. So I just want to repeat. So I started this conversation with Stuart, asking him emails. And basically every day I was thinking about it, reading some paper, and all my thinking evolved. So as my thinking evolved, I needed to rearrange the slides. And I have been reading papers and stuff literally till this morning. So I needed to rearrange the slides. So this slide is really focusing on that there is second order cybernetics and then second order science. And so what is the difference? Is there a difference or is it the same? And then the other question I like to throw in is like, so which cybernetics are we talking about? And I recognize there is Gordon Task, there is von Forster, there is Bateson and Mead, there is Maturana and Varela, and I will add also Karl Muller now. And there are differences, and how are we going to, or emphasis that are, but there are also differences in opinion, and are we going to ignore them, like the self-organizing system, let the market decide which version that people like? Is it valuable to have a discussion about these differences and then see what happens? So that's a question for you all.
May I come in first while I still have a fresh brain?
Yes.
I'm getting tired. Well, it's my view, my choice to believe that cybernetics has the form of a science, has a coherence to it, and that there's a set of underlying distinctions, forms, if you wish, which are common to all cybernetics, all cyberneticians, although they have different emphases and they often have different terminology. And there may be something, but I see the unity within cybernetics, not a set of differences. And certainly Pask, von Förster, Bateson, and Maturana all knew each other and they influenced each other. And you can trace down in quite close detail the extent to which they learned from each other. And so that's my view.
Well, and they also knew McCulloch and Ashby and Gray Walter and Wiener, and they had interactions with scientists, and particularly psychiatrists and brain scientists.
Yes.
I think it's the core of cybernetics, the notion of a purposive system that has embedded goals, that is acting in an external environment, a percept action system. And I think first order cybernetics is about identifying those sorts of feedback loops in systems. And second order cybernetics is about the study of interacting purposive systems in conversations and in mutual action and in cooperation and or dominance relations. I don't think that second order cybernetics is a new form of science because within science, there's always been a large fraction of scientists, if not the majority, who take the observer into account, who are aware of the effects of their measuring instruments on the system itself. In neuroscience, you cannot be unaware of that. And so some of what the rhetoric of second order cybernetics and putting down first order cybernetics and quote unquote normal science, I think, is distorting. It's not really how scientists think or how they go about studying the systems that they're studying.
I agree with that. And I also want to add to that I guess that all those names which are now being typed in and which are listed here, have not, none of them have produced a major book in the last 5 years.
A major book, you say?
Or even a major article.
Yeah, all right. First, I want to comment on what Peter said about that deep down, everyone is kind of a second order cybernetic scientist. Is that what you said? But is at the outside?
It's not the normal. So I'm a neuroscientist. I've worked also in on biological modeling, and I'm a mixture of a theoretician and an experimentalist, and you know, even in the most nuts and bolts fields of biology, molecular biology, they're very much aware of their observables. They're aware that if you measure something this way, it may not correspond to measuring it another way using another technique. Scientists are more self-conscious and more interactive than many philosophers give them credit for, I think. And we need to retain the idea that we're going to have models and theories that are testable. I mean, I don't think you throw that out the window when you go to study social systems. It's true that we're embedded in social systems and we have to interact with social systems. It's more like riding a horse or trying to steer some large ship, you know, whose structure you don't really know. And you can make interventions and then see what works and what doesn't, how the behavior is conforms to what you would expect or not according to your model. But still you have a model, still you have tests of the model, and you're constantly looking at what the system is doing vis-a-vis your expectations of it. So I don't see the break with second order cybernetics as being I see second order cybernetics within a framework of cybernetics, but it doesn't really change the nature of the science that we do.
So, Peter, what you say is very interesting in the following way. I'm moving in some circles where they do psychoanalysis, and there is more and more there's a movement to go and psychoanalyze social scientists and kind of say that they use their work as a way to escape reality. And so that we have there's a lot of...
Did the social scientists use their work to escape reality, or the psychoanalysts use their work?
No, the social scientists.
Okay.
And they create these fantasies. So they're actually fantasies, but we call them virtual reality or whatever. So there are all these nice words, but it's actually a fantasy life that is completely out of touch with reality, but that gives an order structure to their life. And
but you could say the same thing of psychoanalysis. It's completely projective. That's the problem.
Yeah, but
whether you have projection.
Yeah, but can I say that is exactly the training of a psychoanalyst? He needs to recognize how he is continuously projecting and be able to talk about that. And that is then being generalized, that we're all projecting. And the situation in the United States now, there are lots of people that say the reason, I mean, they kind of explain Trump's actions, 45's action as he's projecting. So the language is becoming more current. And number two, I want to say there are different branches in psychoanalysis. So some are much better at doing what you say, is to be self-aware of what they're doing, and there are others who are a little bit more in denial, and they're being whatever. They're going out of, I mean, they're disappearing, so to say. What I wanted to get at is the problem is not so much science, but the social sciences. And I went from molecular genetics into strategic management, and I was welcomed with open arms because they said you may see the blind spots, the way where our theories are failing. And so management is a very peculiar field because there is a lot of pressure on them to produce results.
Yes.
And CEOs want results because they want to know how to be better at what they're doing. They don't want to get a negative performance review. So they want the managers or the researchers to tell them what is a good strategy. And there is just a colossal failure.
And they are getting feedback as to whether their organizations are succeeding or failing.
Yeah, but there is a colossal failure because there is an illusion going on, and actually there's a lot of psychoanalysts or psychotherapists or life coaches, they call themselves now, that are working with CEOs. So it's a very productive profession for psychoanalysts. But what I'm trying to get at, so the academy kind of introduced the idea of the ethical manager. And then suddenly we have Trump as a president, and there was the ban on Muslim traveling. And the academy, people wanted to take the academy a position, and they weren't ready to take a position. So and now there are all these theories about saying how management is humanistic. They can't explain why there is this 1%, why there is this discrepancy in why the middle class is disappearing, while all these good paying jobs are disappearing, while it's all low paying jobs. According to the management theories, we were going to have this wonderful, ethical, interconnected society, and we have the opposite reality. So there is Lowell mentioned it. There's some positive feedback loop that got out of hand. And I think it's precisely because cybernetics or second order cybernetics didn't really get a hold in the academy. And it may be, as Stuart said, that there was some good philosophy of science missing. And instead there is only bad philosophy of science that is being popularized, and I only can I can share the article with you about the crisis with the Muslim ban and how they handled it. But the whole article is descriptive. It doesn't really explain whether there's a good theory to tell what is wrong with the way management research is being done. Now, if I may get back to slide number 4, the purpose of the slide is to point out subtle different emphasis and whether the field is willing to treat them as the requisite variety and kind of say let's further develop them and then see how they act and inform one another. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm leaving.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
go ahead. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So this that I think, I mean, Stuart, that's just an idea for you, and you will see me later. That I thought of you as a von Furster guy, but now I'm going to also add Karl Muller to the mix. And I don't see a lot of Bates and meat in your work. I'm not sure where you are with Maturana, that you're kind of neutral. And neither do I see a lot of ask in your work. And I see a little bit of Gordon Spencer Brown, but that I thought you were really mostly influenced by Heinz von Foerster and Karl Muller, I will add. But the question is, how do you want to proceed, taking into account that there are these other streams in cybernetics? And I'm just throwing that out as a general question to explore while you're writing.
Okay, well, let me just answer some of those questions. I was also strongly influenced by Ross Ashby because he was at at Illinois at the time, although I chose not to take his course, which was a fundamental mistake. He was not a stimulating lecturer the way Heinz was, but I've read it, virtually everything Ashby wrote, and I'm very familiar with Bateson and Mead and Maturana, and I edited some of Maturana's writings along with others. So I am familiar with these other people. Let me just say that my view of philosophy in the United States is very strongly influenced by the fact that my career, since I received my PhD and moved to George Washington University, was in a school of business. Now, when I arrived, they did not have a PhD program. They had a Doctor of Business Administration program, but the faculty wanted a PhD program. So they applied for a PhD program to the Faculty Senate. And the Faculty Senate said, okay, but every doctoral student must take a course in philosophy of science and a course in research methods. And they said, yes, that's fine, go ahead. Okay, well, I was one of those who taught the course in philosophy of science, and I also taught research methods. But sometime later, the faculty was growing increasingly irritated with this course in philosophy of science. And so they eliminated it. The problem was that the students were getting one set of ideas from that course and one set of ideas from their business professors. The students were getting confused, and the simple solution was just get rid of philosophy of science. So they did.
Did it solve the confusion?
Right. Everything hunky-dory after that. Okay. So that's one thing. Now, as one point on this, one of the things when you teach philosophy of science, at least in the United States, one of the things you do is you teach Popper versus Kuhn.
Yeah.
Well, I recently met a faculty member in the Department of Marketing, and I mentioned Kuhn, and she said, who? And I said, Thomas Kuhn, you know, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. She says, I'm not familiar with that. So to me, that's sort of an indication of the depth of lack of knowledge of any issue regarding philosophy. If a professor of marketing, which is communications, business administration, has never heard of Kuhn. Now, and beyond that, there's the whole INET, International, well, it's George Soros's approach to reflexivity theory in economics. And they made a big deal out of the lack of teaching of history in economics.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a professor of economics at GW, and she said, and I asked her, did you study the history of economics when you were a graduate student? She said, no. And I said, is it taught at GW now, the history of economics? She said, no. And I said, why not? She says, well, there's so much new material, you know, all this quantitative mathematical modeling stuff. There's just not room in the curriculum for any mention of history or the evolution of thinking about economics. So I said, well, the evolution of thinking about economics, in my opinion, is absolutely fundamental to any knowledge of economics. She said, well, we don't have time for it in the curriculum because we're teaching mathematical modeling. And I said, okay, so economics went the same way as operations research. They got so involved in their algorithms, they forgot what the original intent was. And as an illustration, the issue was also raised, well, why has business administration or the economy gone the way it's gone in the United States? One of the things we eliminated from business practice was labor unions. Well, same thing with the philosophy of science. It was inconvenient, so they got rid of them. I mean, if you're a business person trying to manage a corporation, you want to implement your ideas, and if the labor union is telling you, no, we don't want you to do that, or you first have to think about this first, one of your impulses is going to be get rid of the labor unions. So we did get rid of the labor unions. And as a result, wages have been flat, and the returns to the top 1% have gone crazy, have just accelerated. So ideas are important.
Yes.
And that's not a commonly known notion among some fields in academia, that ideas really do make a difference.
Well, and even in science, in molecular biology is rabidly anti-theoretical.
Well,
And at the NIH, you know, people think ideas are a dime a dozen. They're not thinking. So we don't have any approaches to like understanding functions of brains in any kind of concerted way. You know, we don't have a theory of how we're going to deal with COVID, really. I mean, anyway, sorry.
So,
Ideas are important. Yeah, I think we can all agree on that.
okay, good. Not much to talk about if we can't agree on that.
so there is this still kind of maybe the question I try to say 4B. I personally started working at some point that a paradox or an inconsistency is what drives the imagination and the openness to new ideas or something. And I'm aware with literature and creativity that says that paradoxes are very productive for creative thinking, and so that they're actually good stuff. But the way I started moving forward is to kind of think there are a gazillion of paradoxes out there already, so we don't need to artificially create them. But I still think there might be useful in terms of comparing ideas or working with ideas. But the other thing I just want to ask you guys, because I try to understand. So what is the difference between second order science and second order cybernetics? I'm kind of thinking that they're more or less the same. It's just a different angle, but is it or is it not?
Well, my answer to that would be that if you're interested in communication and control, if you're interested in communication and decision making, sooner or later, you're going to have to take account of the observer and the origin of a statement, because communication is about statements, descriptions. And the question is, where do they come from? What is the social context of the person who's saying that? And you have to take that into an account. And practicing scientists know this. As was said, you know, good scientists do think about these things because it's quite obvious that you need to think about them. But the way doctoral students are taught, in my experience, in the business school at GW, is they're told that there are two things you need to be concerned with: data and statistics. And your job is to use statistics to glean some mathematical relationships from statistics. And if you do that and do the operations successfully and publish articles, you will get your PhD, you will get promotion and tenure, and you're on your way. And so the whole idea is to be objective, to exclude attention to the observer. I saw this repeatedly at Illinois when I was studying with Heinz. Every time Heinz made the suggestion you should include the observer, people said, "Oh no, you don't. He doesn't understand the philosophy of science. You always exclude the observer." Well, I mean, how do you do science without an observer? Somebody has to formulate a proposition. Somebody has to design an experiment. Somebody has to conduct the experiment, collect the data, process the data, interpret the data, write up the results. How do you do that without an observer? But yet, there was the notion among the professoriate at the university that anyone who suggested including the observer in the practice of science doesn't understand the philosophy of science. So it's that conception of the philosophy of science that second order cybernetics is trying to change. And
So-
that's the application of second order cybernetics. It's an application to philosophy. It's based on neurophysiology and mathematics, that you cannot have descriptions without an observer. And it's obvious, but the university doesn't work that way. Or at least it didn't for a very long time. It's coming around. It is gradually coming around, but it's a struggle.
So, Stuart, the question was that you introduce second order science, and then there is a talk about second order cybernetics. And so I was thinking, is second order science that you just package it for the PhD students and say, if I call it science, they're more likely to listen. But I'm actually just explaining second order cybernetics. Is that?
Okay.
Or is there some subtle, important addition?
There's nothing very subtle about this at all.
There's the difference between the two, second order science and second order cybernetics.
Well, the difference is primarily in Carl Mueller.
Okay, all right.
Carl Mueller was very much involved in Vienna, in
Yeah.
the Vienna Circle, and the more active philosophical discussions in Vienna.
Yeah.
And he said that the academics, the philosophers in Vienna are not paying attention to second order cybernetics, because second order cybernetics is a modification of the conception of science, that you include the observer. Going back to the three levels, you have the practice, the theory, and the philosophy. The idea was the philosophy told you how to do theory, theory tells you how to do practice, but it goes the other way. You have experimental results in neurophysiology, which modify your assumptions underlying philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're interacting, and one influences the other. And the philosophers just weren't paying attention to neurophysiology. Heinz went to various meetings where Popper was talking about the self and its brain and so forth.
Yeah.
And there's no mention of neurophysiology. It was all speculative. It was all introspective. And Heinz thought that was insufficient. I tend to agree. So it's not that we're trying to be imperialistic and change all of science. We're just trying to say, if you were to pay attention to what's happening in the field of cybernetics, then you would come to a conclusion that you need to change your conception of science, at least when it comes to the injunction accepted so widely that you should exclude attention to the observer. That from a physical point of view, that makes no sense. You cannot have descriptions without an observer.
Yes, Bohr and Bridgman and Mach and even Helmholtz, and
Right.
there's a whole line of thinking within science, you know, identified with the pragmatist tradition somewhat. And there was a whole big debate between the pragmatists and the realists in the 70s and 80s. And so I think painting, I mean, it's true that normal science is not very reflective, you know, and they don't think about their methods much. But within science, there's always been a counter tradition in which the observer plays a very explicit role and very self-conscious role. So
I agree with that. I agree with that.
So,
Jaimi, can I ask you if that 4C is your last slide, or?
Well, I no, but we already discussed many of my other slides. Dus that were kind of proactively.
I pay attention to you are running around in a circle, and I think several of us are running in a circle. So I would like you to do the conclusion so I can share you at
Yeah.
least one of my slides.
Yes. Okay. So the two other things, but I'm just leaving that as questions, is this moving forward is like, instead of just trying to explain and connect with the universe and everyone, maybe to focus on one particular well-defined discipline. And then I was wondering, is there such an important discipline? And communication was maybe the one to focus on, since we're all communicating. And then I looked at what are the favorites of Stuart Umpleby, and I saw management, sociology, economics, and then maybe also quantum mechanics with his references to Bohr. And then I had this big signs on action research, because that was very obvious important. Here, that was just if we wanted to be more theoretical about, so what is Stuart studying? And maybe the one, so I had here more ways of, okay. The only slide maybe I wanted to show as closing is that I took like pictures of all the people we talked about, and I was trying to kind of say who is influencing whom, but instead of arrows and everything, I did it with pictures. So let's start with Jason. I'm not sure, you're like a little bit of everyone. Stuart, I assumed you were Heinz von Förster. I heard you talk about Ashby. I was going to add him there, but I wasn't really sure. And now I will add Carl Muller. I think Lute is very clearly Claude Shannon. Actually, Peter, who would you identify with? Because the other people are not part of this conversation. So, which cybernetician made the biggest or helped you understand cybernetics?
Well, so I was an undergraduate at MIT, so I came in in 1974. So I came in contact with Jerry Letvin at MIT, and so Pangaro and I, were introduced to cybernetics partly through Jerry Letvin, who was part of the McCulloch, Pitts-McCulloch group, I was frustrated. I was in biology. I majored in biology, but I was frustrated because I was interested in the organization of life, and also problems of self-complexification, emergence, biological emergence. The MIT biology department at the time, we did not even have an evolution course because they were so molecular that they didn't think that evolution had anything to say about molecular biology, and therefore it wasn't worth having a course on it. I actually asked them that explicitly. So I was interested in theoretical biology, and so I considered studying under Robert Rosen and Howard Pattee, and I ended up studying it with Howard Pattee because there was a systems science program at the University of Binghamton,
yes,
SUNY Binghamton at the time, and so I worked on problems of emergence with, and basically the epistemology of evolutionary robotics, which is also the operational structure of science, percept action systems, goal-directed percept action systems. I proposed at the time systems that would construct themselves and construct their own sensors so as to create new observables, new internal observables. So this is sort of a constructivist program, and I did not know of any devices at the time that actually constructed new sensors. You can have a robot that will construct its own sensors and thereby interact with the world. It turns out that PASC had made this device in the late 50s, this electrochemical device that in essence self-organized its own ear. It became sensitive to sound over time. And this device had been more or less forgotten by the entire community. Pask hadn't written about it. So I took that as I was very much relieved that there were actually some examples of this sort of thing, because people are not at all clear about the difference between a measurement and, say, a computation even. What is the structure of sensing versus computing or logic? And so I count Pask as an inspiration as well, and Maturana as well, because the idea of autopoiesis is extremely important. It's a self-reinforcing, self-constructing, self-regenerating network. But Maturana's idea is not original to him necessarily. Rosen had some more ideas, von Neumann had some more ideas. And so if you come from theoretical biology, you see these people in context. And so, I developed a philosophy of science. It's very much similar to von Glasersfeld's radical constructivism. And so I'm sympathetic to all these people, but I wasn't their student directly. So I stand a little bit outside of cybernetics looking in, but I also consider myself a cybernetician. Unfortunately, in most of my life, the community of cybernetics has not had many natural scientists in it, or engineers per se. They're really mostly social scientists and artists and therapists, or they have been. So there hasn't really been a place within the community for people like me, I guess. And I'm working on a cybernetic theory of brain function. It's based on time codes, because I worked on the neurophysiology of time codes that allow you to multiplex information. But there's no place in the community really to have a meaningful discussion about that. I'm sorry to say.
Can I follow up on that?
Sorry for that. That was rather long-winded. Yeah, it's probably more than you wanted, but
no, it's very good. I used to teach. That was my last teaching job at Binghamton University, and I assume you were referencing George Clear.
Yes.
I mean, I know what George. Yeah.
I took Clear's course, and Don Gauze and many other beloved professors.
Yeah. So Jason, I may.
You unshare. I can follow. I can share my screen.
So you clearly, I didn't know where to put you, so we need you to speak. But Peter, it would be nice.
I'm glad to be in the middle.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll stop.